I'd like to welcome you all to the 212 Candidates Night. We have 6 candidates running for the State Senate or the House of Representatives. I have 2 Senate candidates running for one position. And in alphabetical order, we have Jeff Ballard running for the State Senate. And we have incumbent Jeb Bradley on the Democratic, he's on the Republican ticket. Jeff Ballard is on the Republican ticket. We have 4.
Let's do that again.
Yeah. We have 4 people running for the House of Representatives. Those candidates in alphabetical order are Chris Ahlgren, who's an incumbent on the Republican side. We then have Steve Schmidt, who's an incumbent on the Republican side. We have John White at the tail end over there running on John R. White. And we have Beverly Woods also running on the Democratic ticket. Each candidate will make an opening statement to tell us a little bit about themselves and their positions. They'll be given 2 minutes each to do that. We'll then open up the debate to questions from the audience. I have been presented with some questions here, and we're hopeful we get a lot of audience participation. At the last debate, I rigidly enforced the 2-minute time limit. Each candidate was given 2 minutes to respond. The candidates, by agreement, would like that to be a soft 2 minutes. We do have a timer right here. You may not be able to see it. It emulates the same one that they used in the presidential elections, or the presidential debates. But we would ask the candidates to try to finish right around 2 minutes, finish that thought with perhaps maybe another 15 seconds or so. After every candidate has had an opportunity to respond to a particular question, there'll then be 1 minute of rebuttal. Each candidate will be given 1 minute. We're hopeful that they won't take that full minute, and some that won't take it at all and just defer. That way we can get more questions in. I'd also like to remind all the candidates, as well as the audience, that we're all neighbors, we're all citizens of New Hampshire and the United States, and at the end of the debate, we'll all be that way as well. And I'm confident that we'll have a civil and polite discussion, even though we may disagree on the issues. This debate is scheduled to run from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. We'll be here for 2 hours. And at the end of the debate, each candidate will be given 2 minutes to make summary remarks. And we'll do that around 8:45 with a goal of ending at 9 o'clock. So let's begin with questions. Does anyone in the audience have a question they'd like to start with? And if none, I'll go then to opening remarks. I did this last time, too. We'll start right here with Steve. Steve, would you like to grab that microphone and spend a couple of minutes telling us about yourself?
Thank you, Randy. First of all, I'd like to thank you for again agreeing to moderate this debate, and also to thank all of you people in the audience for giving up a few hours of your time to sit here and participate in this upcoming election. It's going to be a very important one. My name is Steve Schmidt. I moved here to Wolfeboro in 2001 with my wife, Barbara. I retired from Verizon Communications in 2002 as Director of Environmental Affairs. I had a 35-year career, and I had a number of management positions, including those in construction and facilities management, and also some in finance. It was a very interesting career. My wife, Barbara, is a retired school teacher, and we have really enjoyed living here in Wolfeboro. In New Jersey, I was active. I was a member of the North Plainfield Planning Board as a member and as chairman for approximately 12 years. I was very active in Boy Scouts. I was a leader there for upwards of 14 years, and was jokingly referred to as President for Life in the North Plainfield Lions Club, which I've continued on here in Wolfeboro, having already served twice as president. It was my honor and privilege to be asked to run 2 years ago for state representative, and I enjoyed the trust of the majority of voters in town and have served the past 2 years. 2 years ago was a wave election. It was a wave election because we were all concerned about the financial straits in New Hampshire. We were looking at a very severe budget deficit of $900 million, And frankly, the wave election occurred because the vast majority of New Hampshire voters agreed that the spending was simply out of control. As a New Jersey resident, I saw firsthand what happens when state spending gets out of control. We started off with a sales tax, we went to an income tax, and believe it or not, New Jersey at the moment has the highest real estate taxes in the nation. So I can say that it's very easy to see how spending can curtail everything. I see my time is running out, but I hope tonight to have a discussion on these issues. On a going forward basis, the majority of people in this state are very concerned about jobs and the economy, to a lesser degree, spending and taxes. I look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Chris?
Good evening. Thank you, Randy. And thank you all for coming this evening and showing your interest in getting to know all of us up here better. As you've just heard, my name is Chris Ahlgren. I'm running for my 5th term as a state representative. I earned my degree in accounting and business administration with a minor in economics way back in 1983, back in the days when you didn't have to get a second mortgage to pay for a college education. I've lived here for 18 years. I have 2 great sons. One is 9 and the other's 25. I enjoy coaching the younger one in Little League, and I enjoy not having to pay the tuition for the older one. I'm also a small businessman. I own a local restaurant. It's also been around for 18 years, so all I have to do there now is overlook Wolfeboro Bay. My top priority in Concord are jobs and the economy, followed by passing a constitutional amendment for targeting school aid so we can get rid of these donor towns once and for all. During the past 8 years in Concord, I've served on the Resources, Recreation, and Development Committee. While on this committee, I've gained the confidence of the chairman such that he appoints me as the leader for all of our most complicated subcommittee work. In this capacity, it's given me the opportunity to make major differences in reforming things such as the Shoreland Protection Act, which was originally sponsored by Senator Jeb Bradley. I've also been able to make major reforms in the appeals process from our friends over at the Department of Environmental Services. What we did there was we instituted mediation as part of the appeals process. Mediation is a faster, friendlier, and thus a more cost-efficient method of adjudicating these appeals. And believe it or not, no state agency uses the form of mediation for adjudicating their appeals. So hopefully this will serve as model legislation throughout the state. I look forward to the opportunity to continue this debate, and I look forward also to the opportunity to earning your vote for me, Chris Ahlgren, for state representative.
Mr. Bradley?
Thank you very much, Randy. Thank you all for being here. Many thanks to the television network for being able to broadcast this not only live, but I'm sure it'll be repeated. My name is Jeb Bradley. I've grown up here in Wolfeboro. I think a lot of you probably knew my parents, Joe and Helen Bradley. They were the owners of Bradley's Hardware. My mom still lives in Tuftonboro. Barbara and I have been married for nearly 35 years. I hate to say it, I'm going to turn 60 in a couple of days, and I have the white hair to prove it. Barbara and I owned a small business in Wolfeboro, Evergreen Natural Foods, for a long time. I was a painting contractor. This is a great town, as I think everybody knows, to live in, work in, and raise a family in. I wish my 4 kids were closer to home. 3 live in Colorado, 1 in Brooklyn, New York. My top priorities have been, over the 4 years that I've had the honor to serve you and all of Senate District 3, growing the economy, balancing our budget within existing resources, and having reforms of some of the largest state programs, our retirement system, our Medicaid system, so that we can protect the New Hampshire advantage. And to me, that means no sales tax, no income tax. If you send me back to Concord, I'm going to continue to fight, as I did for the past 2 years, to make sure we once and for all end this designation that is so crippling to Carroll County and the Lakes region of donor towns. It was one of my top priorities for legislation in this past session. We were successful in blocking it by changing the education funding formula. But as Chris said, we need a long-term solution for education funding. That will be my top priority, along with fighting for lower health care costs and a disclosure law for independent expenditures. So look forward to answering your questions. Thank you again for being here, and we'll have a great evening.
Mr. Ballard.
Hello, I'm Jeff Ballard from Brookfield. Randy, thank you so much for putting this together. I'd also like to thank the collaboration of the Wolfeboro Democrats and Republicans for being able to make sure this could happen tonight. I usually start it, but unfortunately she's not typically here to hear it, but tonight my lovely wife Stephanie is here, and I'd like to thank her. It's because of her that I'm able to be up here, and all of us have significant others. If it wasn't for their support and understanding of the odd hours and the amount of events that we need to attend, none of us would be able to do this. So we really owe them so much credit and so much thanks. So thank you, hon. Like I said, I'm from Brookfield. I work as an emergency department RN in Dover, New Hampshire. I'm a member of the Army National Guard. My wife and I have recently launched a small business, and we are growing that. We have a son, Tyler, who's in 5th grade. And as I said, I'm a businessman, I'm a veteran. We own rental property, and we own our own property. So the issues that face us in Concord, every time I go there and every time I would vote, I understand directly the impact that it's going to have on the average family in Carroll County. And I also think that I have the foresight and the critical thinking ability to really not only see the impacts of my vote today, but how those votes would affect us long term. And tonight, as we talk about some of the issues, I think I'm going to show you some of the differences between myself and my opponent of critical thinking and long-term effects of the different bills. So again, I'm going to cut it at that because we're going to have so much to talk about, so I'll pass it down.
Ms. Woods.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming, and thank you, Randy, and to all the other candidates for being here. My name is Beverly Woods. I was born in Pennsylvania, but I moved to New Hampshire in 1972 to attend college, and I am very much in love with New Hampshire, and I have lived in several areas of New Hampshire, including Bath, which is on the west coast of New Hampshire, so here I am closer to the east. I've lived in this area since 1997 and in Wolfeboro for the last 6 years. I'm self-employed. I work as a musician and a music teacher and a computer tech. And in doing those things, I work all the time with small businesses who need their computers looked at or their websites fixed. And I also work a lot with people of all ages who are trying to expand their horizons and get involved in the arts. And I've certainly experienced firsthand what some of the challenges are of the current economy, because if you have to choose between putting food on the table or having your child have a music lesson, the music lesson might have to wait. So, but with that said, there's much reason for optimism, I think, at the current moment, and that is good. The real reason I'm here and running is because I want for there to be the small democracy, the small town and local control democracy that we value so highly in New Hampshire, and which first enchanted me the first time I actually went to a town meeting. We are in danger of losing some of our qualities of government, of by and for the people, and I would like to address that, but I'm out of time, and I'm sure we'll be here for long enough for me to get into some of that, so thank you.
Mr. White.
Good evening, all. I'm John R. White, and yes, I do insist on the R because it was my byline for 50 years in journalism, and I'm proud of it. And it also distinguishes me from those other John Whites, of which there are millions upon millions upon millions. I'm running because I'd like to restore some civility to the process in Concord. I'm going to tell you what I would do in Concord. I'm not going to tell you about jobs and deficits that don't exist. I'm going to tell you what I'll do when I get there, and it's no wild social agenda. We have heard from Mr. Schmidt that he was to go to Concord and face a $900 million deficit. It never existed. That deficit was predicated upon the stimulus spending, which was a one-year shot. And when it was gone, they just said, well, we have to keep spending at that level and we'll have a deficit, so we have to cut. But what they cut was basic education, the university system. They cut jobs in the hospitals. They cut aid to the mentally disabled. They cut a whole lot of things. And to make sure that they didn't wind up with an embarrassing surplus, they cut some taxes too, including the tobacco tax. That was, Mr. Ahlgren voted for that, Mr. Schmidt did not. They gave us that cut in the tobacco tax on the premise that our neighbors in Maine and Massachusetts would cross the border spending $3.50 on gas to save 10 cents on a pack of butts. Didn't happen. Wasn't going to happen. Even if they brought 100 cartons home, it would still be not much money at a dime a pack. And it would put them in jeopardy of a prison sentence, because smuggling to avoid the cigarette tax in Massachusetts and Maine is a crime. We didn't get any benefit at all because the cigarette wholesalers raised the price 9 cents, the retailers raised it a penny, the smokers got bupkis, and we lost about $20 million, which would have paid for a lot of snow plowing. We managed to save some money last
John, if you could sort of wrap it up, you're 30 seconds over.
Sorry, I wasn't even looking at the clock. All right. We'll get to the rest of that in the rest of the evening. Thank you.
All right, thank you, candidates. A couple of observations. As you pass the microphone back and forth, try to keep the cord off the signs. We've already knocked Mr. Ahlgren's sign off, and it would be helpful to just keep it a little bit back so you don't take the rest of them off during the process. I do have some questions, and we can start with this question. It's been asserted that New Hampshire has the 4th oldest population in the United States. That presents certain opportunities and certain challenges. What is your message to seniors? And we'll start with, why don't we start with you, John? We'll come back down this way.
My message to seniors is, if things are going to continue the way they are now, stay away, because you're not going to be happy here. The Republican legislature is now in the hands of free staters and extremists. It's not that your father's Republicans or your uncle's Republicans that we used to know. I used to be one of those Republicans. These people have an extreme agenda, as Grover Norquist put it, to reduce the government to such a size that it can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. It's a destructive enterprise. And because of our tax structure, those of you who come here and retire are going to be facing higher and higher and higher real estate taxes, because 67% of our expenditures is based on real estate taxes. No, the way it is now, I don't think the elderly have a very good chance here. The Republican administration wants to take over Medicare for the state. They have moved to disavow themselves from the so-called Obamacare. They're not making it a pleasant place for old people. They don't even want them to vote. That's why we have a voter ID law now, because old people are liable to vote to keep Social Security and Medicare. And we don't want that.
And Beverly?
Well, my message to seniors is pay attention to what all the candidates stand for, add up all the numbers, look at what you're really paying and what you're really going to pay under different proposals, and please get out there and vote on November 6th, because all of those things that John said are indicative of what might happen if the current reality continues. But we can turn that around on November 6th, and I think that would be an excellent plan. We do have the difficulty of our tax structure and the fact that the tax structure is based on not only the real estate tax, but also the dividends and interest. And between those things, the tax burden on New Hampshire seniors is very high, and that is one of the things that I would like to hope to address in a productive way, should you send me to the State House.
Mr. Ballard?
Well, I'd have to agree with a lot that's been said so far. Seniors need to use caution. Unfortunately, there's no other way. The cuts that we saw last year, or in 2010, when the 2011 legislature, when they put together their budget, when we saw those cuts go into place, they made all these great cuts, but the need for the services that those funds were covering didn't go away. People with mental health problems don't suddenly have mental health problems because we're not funding the programs. Children, the children in need of service, that was such a phenomenal program, and we took away that funding. So those kids that had that funding, they're not all of a sudden on the straight and narrow, and they're not going to become productive members of society and aren't going to be committing petty crime, which often is aimed at a lot of our elderly population. The managed Medicaid system that's been put in place. When we see the cuts, every day something new comes out. Today, the New Hampshire Ambulance Association announced the cuts that they were going to be facing because under the managed Medicaid, they're going to be reimbursed at a 20% lower rate. So, I don't know if Wolfeboro charges bills for their ambulance service. Many towns that run their own ambulance, that's a good source of revenue that eases the burden on property taxpayers. Now, the ambulances, which already operate on razor-thin margins, many of them are private ambulances. So again, it's going after small business. Many of them are, run by the towns that are using those to ease the burden on property taxpayers. Now they're going to feel that burden. So all it's done is shifted cost down to the local taxpayers. And we know that the burden of most of our systems in New Hampshire is on property taxpayers. So if you're a senior, you're going to buy here, you're going to feel it.
Thank you. Mr. Bradley?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I would respectfully disagree with my three friends to the left of me. The fact that so many seniors want to live in our great state of New Hampshire is a testament to the fact that New Hampshire is a wonderful state to live in. Not only for seniors, but for everybody. And the fact that there's so many seniors here, that they've come here to retire here, means that we're doing something right. Now, that study brought up some issues that I think are very important as we look to grow jobs, to be able to attract more young people to stay here. But let's also remember that, unlike I think our three friends to the left of me who I think, perhaps I'm wrong, would like to revamp our tax structure, New Hampshire's in a competitive global market, and if we're going to be attractive not only to seniors, but to young people to be able to stay here, to start a business, to grow a business, to be able to employ people, we have to have a competitive tax structure. That's why I fought to get rid of the LLC tax that was dropped into the budget in the previous legislature without a public hearing. It was a jobs-killing income tax on business owners. It's why I fought to reform something called reasonable compensation, so that business owners are not assessed by the Department of Revenue Administration an income tax on the profits that they pay themselves as salary. We need to have a tax structure that works for everybody, and the fact that New Hampshire has largely survived this economic downturn that has lasted forever, it seems, and we're doing significantly better than other states, is because of our tax advantage. We need to make it work for everybody, for seniors, for people that are in their working age, for small business owners, for working families, and for kids. And I think that we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about the budget, but we had to make tough choices, as working families and small businesses did around our state, to deal with the fact that we were left with a huge deficit, and we did that.
Thank you, Jeb. Mr. Ahlgren.
Thank you, Randy. I concur with most of what, probably I concur with all of what Senator Bradley said, quite frankly. But, however, I particularly concur with the fact that if we had the fourth largest number in the country, the environment must be pretty good for senior citizens. Now, we have this book up here. It's the 50-state comparison. And one of the comparisons they make here is the senior citizens in poverty. And where do you think New Hampshire rates out of the 50 states with senior citizen poverty? 49th. We have almost the lowest poverty rate for senior citizens in the entire country. So I don't think that the big worry here is our senior citizens not having any money, okay? And I also agree with the fact that we need to have a tax structure that's stable. Yes, a lot of our taxes are derived from real estate. That is true. But real estate tax is not as volatile. It's easier to budget. When you go home and you sit around your table, you look at how much money do we have coming in. And based on how much money you have coming in, you decide on how much money you can spend, okay? And real estate taxes, they help you with that. I don't know if people realize this, but there's a fairly commonality between how big your house is versus how much real estate tax you pay and how much money you have. If you have a lot of money, you probably have a large home. If you have not much money, you're probably living in a little smaller home. I know that my home isn't as big as some other folks that are my neighbors in my neighborhood, and so thusly my real estate tax is lower. So I think, it's a New Hampshire value that we live within our means here. People understand their tax structure. They've come here to live. Senior citizens are coming in
And if
faster.
you could wrap that up, I know the time's a little off on you because it got started late, but if you could wrap it up.
Okay. So that I would just like to say that the senior citizens are not being as compounded upon as some might say.
Mr. Schmidt.
Thank you. As a senior citizen, I can tell you that this is a great state to live in, one that I really enjoy. I'd like to talk about a few things. We talk about taxes and how unfair they are. And let me just briefly say, in reference to what Chris just said, and he borrowed my book, by the way, I was going to use that line. But let's talk about total tax burden. And that is how much actually comes out of your pocket. And let's compare that to Vermont, and let's compare that to Maine. New Hampshire ranks number 44. The total amount of state and local government taking, or taxes that come out of your pocket in New Hampshire, is 8%. In Maine, it's 10.1%. In Vermont, it's 10.2%. Now, where do you think seniors are better off? I would propose that that's right here in New Hampshire. I'd also like to spend just a few seconds on Mr. White's discussion of our non-existent $900 million deficit a couple years ago. The fact of the matter is that deficit was a direct result of $167 million and one-time stimulus funding that was used on a one-time basis. The Democrats borrowed $91 million for school aid, borrowed the money. There was another $40 million for debt service. That's borrowed money to pay for the cost of more borrowed money. We had accounting tricks. We took $90 million out of the state liquor fund and we reclassified that from the general fund to a separate fund, and they counted that as budget savings. Folks, believe me, there is a structural deficit of almost $1 billion in this state, and it took some very hard decisions to correct it. It's just like being in your home, folks. If you take in $100 a week, you cannot spend $125 a week. It's microeconomics. On a macro basis, just look at where this country is going, where we spend $11 for every $7 we take in. It's got to give.
Would anybody like to rebut any of the comments? And if you would, you can have a minute or less to rebut it. If not, we'll move on to the next question.
You go ahead.
All right. Well, first, I'd really like to address this this fantasy that if the state doesn't spend the money, the need goes away. Again, I think that shows the short-sightedness that I talked about that I wanted to highlight. You know, there's this idea that if the state cuts this funding, the need goes away. You know, the need doesn't go away. People with mental health issues still have mental health issues. So now, instead of receiving the care that they want, which, you know, if you can treat a mental health patient, keep them stable, it's very affordable to treat them. When you cut all the funding so they can no longer receive treatment, they end up in the emergency department. I see that every single day that I go to work. We've had patients that sit in the emergency room for 5, 6, 7 days at a time waiting for admission to the state hospital. Now, just because the legislature decided not to fund the state hospital at the proper level doesn't mean that the need for the state hospital went away. Someone else is paying that. We talk about the rising cost of health care. I can tell you exactly where it comes from. Again, this $900 million deficit, every single state, we don't have a budget that gets to be carried over. New Hampshire has to balance the budget every time. Every single legislature, whether it was a Democrat or a Republican-controlled legislature, has balanced the budget. This is just a fairy tale to say there's a $900 million deficit, because we know it's just not true.
Anybody else like to respond? And again, the question was, what was your
gonna-
message to seniors? I know you've all drifted a little bit from that. Jeb?
Well, I really want to take an opportunity to respond on the budget. Yes, the budget that we inherited when 2010 and the electoral change happened was balanced technically. It was balanced with borrowed money for operating expenses. It was balanced with the prospective sale of state assets that never happened. It was borrowed by the attempt to raid almost $100 million from a doctor's medical liability fund. It was balanced by moving items like the Liquor Commission into another fund without changing the spending. But the bottom line, and this is what's vitally important for people to remember, is that under those 4 years, before we took over in 2011, spending increased from $9.36 billion to $11.5 billion. It simply was unsustainable, and we had to make some very difficult choices. Would I have liked to have had more money to fund certain things like the University of New Hampshire? Absolutely, but we had to do what working families and small businesses had to do in a very tough economy: tighten our belt. The prior legislatures to us had raised almost 100 taxes and fees.
If you could wrap
So we were
up.
out of options in terms of raising revenue.
John and then Chris.
If you guys were so interested in balancing the revenue with the expenses, why did you rush to cut taxes, cut the cigarette tax, to cut business taxes, and not fund a few of the programs instead of cutting those? Why did you insist on turning back federal money? Why do we keep hearing that we shouldn't take any money from the federal government? Why not? It's ours. If you're so interested in balancing the budget, I think you'd be shaking the cushions for the loose change. Whatever the government would give you, you would take. But you can't have it both ways. You can't tell me you're solving a great $900 million problem that doesn't exist and then turn away federal money and lower taxes for cigarettes and lower taxes on businesses and lower taxes willy-nilly while you're slashing essential programs. If you want the state to prosper, you're going to have to finance education. I don't want to see a bunch of unemployable, ignorant students running around waving the guns you want them to have.
Anybody else want to comment on the seniors that hasn't already spoken?
I would.
Beverly, you haven't responded yet.
Yes. Yes, I would like to respond to Representative Schmidt's comments about the tax burden in New Hampshire. Those figures are a little different from the figures that I've seen, but what he left out is that your tax burden in New Hampshire differs drastically depending where you are on the income percentile group. And states around us, it's much more even. If you are in the lowest 20%, you might pay a little bigger percentage of your income than the people who are in the top 10%. But in New Hampshire, it goes like this. If you are in the top 10%, your tax rate is effectively very low, under 3%. And if you are in the bottom 20%, your average tax rate is around 10%. And the problem with the seniors is that the house is not actually necessarily dependent on your income. And we have seniors who are paying 30% of their income in property taxes, and that can happen here.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Chris?
Thank you, Randy. I know this isn't about seniors, but I just want to rebut.
It's
just a
okay,
couple.
no one else stuck to the issue either.
Number one is this misnomer about there not being a structural deficit. Governor John Lynch, who is a Democrat, was just out there the other day bragging about the fact that we had a $14 million surplus, and that in the face of a $800 million structural deficit. So I would think that if the governor of New Hampshire is saying that this budget started out with an $800 million structural deficit, I think it probably did. Also, just in regard to the federal money that we returned, that federal money was designated to set up an insurance exchange for Obamacare, okay? And we as a state decided that we were not going to accept that money and spend money for that purpose when we didn't know if Obamacare was going to come about or not. That was to the tune of about $800,000, almost $1 million. So that is the federal money that we spent. We couldn't have used that money to balance our budget. That was money that we needed to use to spend for this insurance exchange. Thank you.
Well, let's move on to another question. Next question is during the debate Monday night between the gubernatorial candidates, Maggie Hassan and Ovid Lamontagne, it was represented that New Hampshire only has 2.5 medical insurance companies that provide medical insurance coverage in the state of New Hampshire. How do we get more insurance companies if that's the goal? And if that's not the goal, what is? And a follow-up question was, should companies be able to charge differing amounts for smokers versus non-smokers, people that are obese versus keep themselves in good shape, i.e., can companies charge more for self-created problems? So how do you handle medical insurance, medical costs? Why don't we start with talk about Chris, and we'll go this way, and I'll keep working into the pack. Chris, do you want to answer the first question, and then Jeb next, and we'll go around the loop.
Okay. Well, there are a couple things that can help, bring down the cost of insurance. And one of those things is not mandating things that have to belong on the insurance. And this is the more things that we mandate the insurance companies to provide, the higher the premium is going to be. When you're able to have more of a cafeteria plan about what you want to be covered for and what you don't want to be covered for, your premium would go down, and more insurance companies would be able to come in. Next, obviously the cost of medical costs has to do with how much we're paying for litigation of medical cost. We passed a bill to get early settlements for those medical suits. And quite frankly, those suits weren't for the big suits. Those suits were really for the smaller suits, the ones that the attorneys don't like to take because they get paid a percentage. So I'm sure that other people have something to say, so I'll just turn over my time.
All right. Mr. Bradley.
Thank you very much. This state made a decision when it was in 1994 when Senator Shaheen, now Senator Shaheen, also was then Senator Shaheen, to go to what is known as community rating. There were some 20 insurance companies that sold policies in New Hampshire. We're down to basically Anthem and Cigna and Harvard Pilgrim Health because of community rating. There have been some changes to it over the years, but what community rating allows is anybody that wants to purchase health insurance, an insurance company has to accept them. They can't rate you out based on a high risk. I think that's a pretty reasonable insurance reform. It has driven up the cost of health insurance in New Hampshire, and unfortunately it's had the effect of driving a lot of the other insurers out of the state. But with health insurance availability being so critical, I think that's a reform that's generally speaking worked in New Hampshire, and quite frankly something that we should have nationwide. Unfortunately, the whole discussion about the Affordable Care Act and healthcare costs in general dealt with too often government takeover of healthcare and didn't deal with the cost drivers. Chris touched on legislation I sponsored, which will be a very innovative tort reform bill, something that has been a priority for lowering medical costs for a long time. We passed a bill this year that will allow more providers to come in without having to go through the bureaucratic process called certificate of need. More competition from providers. One thing that's absolutely essential is better transparency of costs so that if you end up going to a medical provider, you know what you're likely to pay so you can shop around. And with that, there ought to be metrics about quality of care. I think that we should be looking at cross-state purchasing of insurance the way you can automobile insurance. It's not easy to do. There are some consumer safety issues that are important. We ought to allow small businesses to pool together to be able to either in-state or cross-state purchase health insurance in larger groups. These are all reforms that will drive down the cost of health insurance, but much of the issue is driven by what's happening in Washington as well as, to a certain extent, what's happening in Concord.
Thank you. Mr. Ballard.
Well, it's interesting that Senator Bradley mentions that we should allow small companies to be able to pool together to purchase insurance, because that's exactly what the healthcare exchanges that are part of the Affordable Care Act do. So I wonder if that's such a great idea. Why did we turn away the money to have New Hampshire control to be able to set up those programs ourselves? When things are in their favor, the Republicans like to talk a lot about states' rights and states' control. So we have the ability to control our destiny. And they said, no, we don't want that. So, we know, I agree completely that setting up exchanges is going to be one of the most effective ways to control healthcare costs. I disagree about the idea of going across state lines. The policy is going to be effective in New Hampshire, so it's still going to need to meet New Hampshire standards. So it doesn't matter whether you're buying it here, if you're buying it in California, a company in California is just going to have to set up 50 different policies to match the 50 different states and the 50 different sets of standards that they have. So that's just a red herring, as is tort reform. As someone who works in a very high-risk area of medicine, the amount of unnecessary procedures that we do because of the idea of we're going to get sued if we don't do them is virtually non-existent. The reason why we do so many extra tests and so many virtually unneeded procedures is because of this idea of competition of healthcare. Competition is great if you're in private business, but in medical care, all it does is raises the cost. Because if someone thinks they need a CT and we don't do it for them, they're just going to go to a different hospital next time. So everything that we do is trying to raise customer satisfaction because of this idea of that we're competing, like in the Seacoast, with 5 other hospitals. So that's where one of the other driving forces of healthcare, not tort reform, or tort.
Ms. Woods?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is basically the end game of the question of, does a for-profit model actually provide good health care to the citizens of this state and of this nation? And if you look all over the rest of the world, every other developed nation has a system in which the individuals are not held hostage to our ability to afford insurance. And this is a daily issue for me. I am 56 years old. I am self-employed. I cannot afford insurance. So I don't have any insurance. So if you don't have any insurance either, I am definitely your candidate, because I think that people who have insurance underestimate the difficulties faced by those who have no insurance. And so these 2 or 2.5 companies, I can't afford any meaningful policy. And if I did dip into my savings and pay for the policy, if I needed any treatment, then I still wouldn't be able to afford it, because when you are cutting down the costs, you're cutting down the things that are covered. And if you want something efficient, then the last thing we should be doing is talking about repealing the Affordable Care Act, which at least mandates that the insurance companies need to spend 80% of what they take in on health care.
Mr. White?
I think one approach would be to ban the advertising of pharmaceuticals. Instead of promoting people to think they're sick and think they need a drug and nagging their doctors, what about this drug or that drug I heard about on television, we might calm a lot of people down if we just didn't advertise pharmaceuticals. The exchange program should have been pursued. I think a good place to start in New Hampshire would be to introduce a proven successful program that's practiced in Massachusetts. It was brought in by Governor Romney. It was the model for Obamacare. Once it got that tag, it became objectionable to a lot of people. But it seems to work in Massachusetts, and I think maybe we should explore it here.
Mr. Schmidt?
I think trying to solve the healthcare issues is something akin to trying to solve world hunger. But let me say a couple of things that's interesting about New Hampshire. New Hampshire has one of the healthiest populations in the nation, way up there. We also are the highest for healthcare costs, so that's quite a paradox. There's a number of things that can be done. Of course, tort reform would be helpful. Of course, buying policies across state lines where there's true competition would be helpful. We've heard reference to the Massachusetts health care. It's good, but we were talking about how expensive it is. It's very expensive. We're talking about the Affordable Care Act. Well, I think we ought to rename it the Unaffordable Care Act. Health care costs have gone up at a degree haven't seen in the past 10 years. There's a lot to be done. We talked about the certificate of need for hospitals, where basically there is no competition in New Hampshire. If a new hospital wants to come in, at the moment they have to go before a certificate of need board, which is comprised of members of the existing hospital. So basically what you have are members protecting a monopoly. As Jeb said, this is going to sunset in 3 years and go away. It's an important step. I'm sure there's a lot more that can be done also.
Would anybody like to rebut it all? Mr. Ballard?
Well, I guess none of us actually answered the question that was asked. So I'll try to touch on the actual question. One of the questions was, should smokers pay more for their insurance? If you want to be the live free or die state, you have to be willing to take personal responsibility. So many of our preventable illnesses and preventable diseases are directly linked to smoking, in addition to ear infections, upper respiratory infections, asthma, in children who are exposed to secondhand smoke. So the question was, should they pay more? Then yes, I think it is right to have higher premiums for smokers because that's their choice. Live free or die. You have to take responsibility for your choices. Obesity is much more difficult to tie that. The way our food and diet is structured, the cheapest, most affordable food is also the worst for us food. So unfortunately, as a result of our food system, a lot of people in poverty are suffering from obesity just because they don't have any access to quality food.
Anybody else like to weigh in? Mr. Bradley?
Thank you again, Randy. I just want to go back to the tort reform issue. I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of hospital people that run our hospitals, as well as a number of doctors. And I'm being honored by the New Hampshire Medical Society next week for my tort reform bill. If you talk to doctors, and I'm sure you do, there are any number of things where they feel that if they don't practice defensive medicine and take on unnecessary tests and procedures or extra medications, things like that, they run the risk of litigation. And that is a cost driver in our overall medical system. The American Medical Association has in the past said that nearly $100 billion, that's nationwide costs, are attributable to defensive medicine. So we need something like my legislation did, which is voluntary, I would have to add, but it's an early offer system that protects patients and actually, under most circumstances, gives them a better outcome. It's very innovative, first in the nation, and I was pleased to be able to work with the Medical Society and the Hospital Association, be able to bring this kind of innovation to our state.
Anybody else like to rebut or weigh in? Steve?
Just a quick comment. I serve on the Health, Human Services, and Elderly Affairs Committee. We've had quite a bit of testimony supporting the fact that preventive medicine is indeed practiced. You know, it's come before our committee on many times. We've asked the question point blank: why do we have such a healthy population in New Hampshire, and yet we have the highest health insurance costs? What's wrong here? You know, and those issues rise to the surface. You know, the lack of competition, the lack of tort reform, practicing medicine, make sure you're not sued. Some of these tests are, you know, my point being is to discount them really does a disservice. You know, if you can't acknowledge a problem, I don't know how you can fix the problem.
Anyone else want to respond? We'll move on to the next question. We're going to move on to the next question. At the national level, there's been a lot of discussion about jobs, and the unemployment rate. What do you propose that New Hampshire do to create more jobs and attract more businesses? Second part of the question is that same question was asked yesterday of Congressman Frank Ginter when he came to Wolfeboro, and he said that efforts had been made to try to have Canadian companies come into New Hampshire, as well as from surrounding states, but he specifically mentioned Canada. And he said there were 4 impediments to bringing Canadian companies in. One, that the U.S. corporate tax rate was 35%, the Canadian rate was 15%. Although that's nothing that you can do at the state level, that was an impediment. The second was the exchange rate problem that we now have with Canada, and again, that's not something that you can control. But he said there are 2 things that did prevent companies from coming into New Hampshire. One, that we have a fairly high New Hampshire business profits tax compared to other states, and then we had high energy costs, and that those were impediments, not that there weren't solutions to those problems. But the question is what's your proposal? How do you create more jobs and more businesses? And we'll start with Jeb and go around that way.
Thank you very much for that question. There are a lot of drivers in the jobs creation, and we are in a very, very competitive global market, so the changes that we make are vital. That's why we have to have a tax policy in New Hampshire that is limited, and we have to have a budget that's balanced, that brings certainty to our business community, that we're not going to have taxes like the LLC tax, especially the LLC tax that was dropped into a budget without a public hearing, and no one had the opportunity to comment on it. So reducing business taxes as the economy improves and as we're able to meet our needs budget-wise, making those business taxes more competitive is vital for New Hampshire. Keeping our state without an income tax and without a sales tax is vitally important to New Hampshire. If we're going to do that, we need a long-term solution to education funding. And I've said it many times, my top priority going back to Concord, if I'm fortunate enough to do so, is to make sure that we have a long-term education funding solution without donor towns. And we fought to block donor towns from coming back in the last budget, and we were successful. Healthcare, energy, those are critical issues. I've already touched on how we can lower the cost of healthcare. I've had a number of energy bills over the years that I've been in the legislature trying to not only lower the cost of energy, but enhance the supply of renewable energy. And certainly one of the bills that the governor just signed recently will enhance renewable energy opportunities. And lastly, the regulatory climate is important too. I sponsored legislation in 2010 that became Senate Bill 86 in 2011 that would have given a warning to employers before the Department of Labor came in with large fines for paperwork violations. This is the kind of regulatory policy that we really need to establish to make sure that we're not mistreating those people that would create jobs. And that bill certainly is a step in the right direction. We should not be tolerating bad behavior, but at the same time, there's so many complicated regulations today that employers have to deal with. We need to help them comply as opposed to dropping the boom on them with large fines. I was proud to work to sponsor that.
Thank you. Mr. Ballard.
All right, a question about unemployment. That's certainly a very timely question, especially since New Hampshire has witnessed our unemployment rate go up for 3 straight months, while the national rate has continued to fall, finally, thankfully, getting under 8%. So you have to ask, why is it that New Hampshire was able to get through, the fall of 2008 collapse? And, Sarah Bradley can speak to this because he was there and he saw the great job that the Democratic majority did. And while the rest of the country saw their unemployment rate going like this, New Hampshire had a very steady unemployment rate through the collapse. And now when we're in a time of recovery, all of a sudden we see New Hampshire's unemployment rate start to drop. So you have to ask, what's the factor there? And it's the lack of stability that this legislature has given us. When we had the Democrats in control in 2008, and Sarah Bradley was there, he saw that, yes, we raised some fees, because that's what you do when you see that there's going to be a shortfall. The government has a responsibility to make up for it. They are job creators, whether we like to admit it or not. That's why thousands of people rely directly on the government for their paycheck. But I'm getting sidetracked there. So we've seen unemployment rates going up, and I attribute that to the lack of stability we've seen. If you're a business in Massachusetts, in Canada, in Maine, in Vermont, wherever you are, do you want to go to New Hampshire? Because before, we've always had very high business tax, and companies still came here. Why was that? We had educated employees, we had healthy employees, and we had I like not having an income tax or sales tax, and I wouldn't vote for either one of those. I would definitely vote against those. But businesses like the stability, and now that we see so much instability, you're saying that unemployment is going up.
Ms. Woods.
Well, the study that I read found that business owners were not concerned very much about whether we had no income tax or no sales tax, and that one of the large features of a deterrent to be here is that because we are so very reliant on the property tax, then businesses own property and have to pay property tax, and it's a big deal. So I'm not sure about Senator Bradley's assertion that no income tax and no sales tax is the answer, because we've had that for quite a while, and so why aren't we thriving? The other answer to the question of why aren't we thriving is, at the moment, we've had all these cuts, and you can look at millions of dollars in lines going, oh, this line is zeroed out, and that line is zeroed out, the other line is zeroed out. But what was in there besides numbers? People and jobs. They were in those lines that got cut. We have laid off a lot of people, and it's really a big drag on our ability to function as a state in a lot of ways. And you can't just cut and hope that some tax money will magically appear from somewhere. You can't cut the business taxes and have no income tax and have no sales tax and cut the tobacco tax and cut everything and hope that money will be there. That is just fantasy land. So we really have to do some very pedestrian things. We have to fund education, and we have to maintain our roads, because if we don't have good education and roads to get things to people, then businesses aren't going to want to be here. And we also need high-speed internet access throughout the state. Yesterday.
Mr. White.
Mr. Ballard put his finger on a very important point: stability. My friends at the other end of the table 2 years ago were talking jobs. That was their primary concern. Then they went to Concord, and what do we get? We got guns in the State House. We got votes for legislation to eliminate concealed carry permits. We got legislation to allow carrying loaded long guns, shotguns, rifles, crossbows in automobiles. We got legislation to avoid federal regulation on anything produced in New Hampshire in the way of firearms. We get cuts in education. We get cuts in public works. You want business to come here, and the first thing they see is the lights are out on the bridges at night. The rest stops are closed. That's a real welcome we give them. The idea of taxes being the major deterrent for business is strictly hogwash. Historically, this country had its greatest growth rate in business and enterprise at a time when taxes were historically their highest. Business will go where business can make money. And if we have an educated labor force and stability in the state, they will come here. They may be a little dissuaded by a stand your ground law, or as the police call it, the shootout enabling legislation. They may be upset by a number of the things we've done to destroy the quality of life in this state. But they're certainly not going to come here if there's potholes in the road and the bridges are falling down. They're not going to come here if the people we turn out of schools aren't fit to count up to 10. They're not going to come here if they don't have an educated workforce, and they're not going to come here if they can't make money. As long as they can make money, you can tax it.
Mr. Schmidt, with the microphone.
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. There you are, sir.
Well, I don't think I have enough time to refute every one of John's talking points, so I'm just going to concentrate on jobs here. At the height of the recession, New Hampshire's unemployment rate was 7.3%. It went down as far as 5.5% and has now ticked up to 5.7%. New Hampshire does have a very generally speaking, as compared to the other states, a very well-educated workforce. That's a big plus for us. To deny that the total corporate tax rate in New Hampshire is not an issue for business, it's frankly to be in denial. It would help if we could tweak that down a little bit to encourage them to stay or to expand. Also, there's a red tape issue in New Hampshire. Maybe not unique to New Hampshire, but there definitely is a red tape issue. It's not easy to grow or expand a business in this state. The regulatory environment is such that it makes it very difficult. This state really needs an ombudsman who can welcome business and facilitate their expansion or their growth, cut through the permitting, and make it as easy as it can possibly be. That's one of the things that are lacking. We passed legislation in the House that was quite controversial this past term. That was called right to work legislation. The fact of the matter is states that have right to work legislation are growing at a faster rate and having a better employment picture than those without. Now, before anyone says I'm anti-union, I'd like you to know that I started my career as a member of Local 827, IBEW, Electrical Brotherhood Workers in New Jersey, and I have fondness for unions. If you put all of these things together, I'm sure we could lower New Hampshire's unemployment rate even more and even encourage more businesses to come in. But those are the things we need to address. We need to talk about that corporate tax structure. We need to talk about the red tape issue. And frankly, we need to talk about the educated workforce. And I'm sure that's going to come up too. Thank you.
Mr. Ahlgren.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Well, the question was about jobs, so I'm going to talk about jobs. I got to say that I'm baffled by the assertion that the unemployment rate is now somehow awfuler than it was during the height of the recession. But I'll leave it to my good friend Mr. Schmidt's here's rebuttal to that. One of the things that I would look at as far as our tax structure is concerned is the BET tax, or it's the business enterprise tax. This is a tax that's essentially a payroll tax. It is not based on profits. So if you're a new business and you come to New Hampshire and you invest a lot of money to try to build a factory and you employ a lot of people here, and guess what, in that first year you lose money, you still owe the state of New Hampshire a business enterprise tax. Does that sound counterintuitive, that we're going to tax you just because you started a business here, you have an enterprise here, so now we're going to give you a tax? Well, what I would propose would be like a 5-year exemption to the business enterprise tax to help new companies come in. I agree that having a lower cost of energy, that's a big problem with new companies here. The cost of health care, although over 90% of our citizens are covered by health insurance in the state of New Hampshire. The corporate tax rate is high, but we don't have an income tax, so that offsets that. But cutting red tape, I've been very involved with that. This last session we worked on a thing called an integrated land permit that took a shoreland permit, a wetlands permit, a subsurface water permit, and an all-terrain permit and put them all together. So you could go get all of those at one time, because you know what? Now you have to go apply for those separately, and they all have a different path. And so we put those all together, and we're working on that. I think this year we're proposing that legislation again, and I think we're going to get it through. Another thing that I did was I personally sponsored a bill that cut the fee that you would pay to the state of New Hampshire for wetlands mitigation in half. Now, this is not getting rid of wetlands. What this wetlands mitigation thing is a fee that you pay.
If you could try to wrap up.
Okay. I'll wrap up. I'll get back to my wetlands mitigation later, but let me just say that the money that we paid for the wetlands is still the same. It's just the money they paid to the state was what got different.
Anybody want to rebut anything that's been said? Mr. Ballard.
I'm getting this habit of having to wait until the rebuttal to actually answer the question, so I'll do that this time. One of the things that Senator Maggie Hassan, who's running for governor, has stated is that if she's elected, she'll be out on the road being New Hampshire's most active salesperson. She has some great ideas about partnering with business and then with our community college systems to find out what programs businesses need to have their employees educated in. My wife works in telecommunications. They have very specific certifications and very specific needs when they hire a new employee. And it would be great for a company that the company that she works for, if they were able to go to an HTI or the community college system and say, we're going to need over the next, X amount of years, we're going to need X amount of people with this certification. And then for the college to set up that program to provide that specialized education, because as we become more reliant on technology, we're going to need more employees with that very specific skill set. So as far as addressing unemployment, that's one thing I think we can do to attract new business.
Thank you. Anyone else that wants to weigh in on that, or should we move to another question? Mr. White and then Mr. Bradley.
There is one business that our friends brought back, loan sharking. They brought back payday and title loans at rates of interest of 300, 400% a year. That didn't help New Hampshire much, but it's a business they brought back and they should get due notice for it.
We appreciate your brevity. Mr. Bradley.
Well, I would just respond to my good friend, Mr. White. The governor vetoed payday loans, and the Senate upheld that veto. And I also want to respond to something that my good friend, Mr. Schmidt, said. And since Senator Hassan was raised, it was roughly that time that she was dropping the LLC tax without a public hearing into the budget that our unemployment rate peaked at whatever that was, over 7%. And then it gradually went down over the last couple of years. And it has ticked up slightly in the last 2 months. There's no question. But I think anybody looking at New Hampshire's unemployment rate would understand, if you talk to business owners, as I do, that's being driven by policies in Washington. The debt ceiling issue, the sequestration issue, the uncertainty about the tax situation as of January 1st. These are what are driving uncertainty in New Hampshire right now. And if people think that if we somehow had an income tax and that was going to solve our problems, we should try being California or New Jersey. And lastly, there's been some talk about schools here. Well, we have a beautiful new facility.
If you could wrap that up quickly.
We have a beautiful new facility next door. New Hampshire has met its commitment to educating its kids. Chris and I, along with Dave Knox, who can't be here tonight, were instrumental in making sure that the funding went through to ensure the new schools were built in the Governor Wentworth.
Anyone else that has not already responded? Let me just get to others first, John.
I just want to,
Wait, let,
seconds that I gave you back.
that's fair, but does anyone else want to speak first? Chris.
I just want to finish my thoughts on the wetlands mitigation. Essentially what this was, it was a fee that you would pay to the state. It was a 20% fee. This wetlands mitigation program, it allows a developer that there may be a wetland and there's nothing he can do. He needs to build his property. He can pay money. Around here, it's about $45,000 an acre to go ahead and fill in that wetland. That's what it cost him. And he pays that to the Wetlands Mitigation Fund. And what happens is we take that $45,000 and then we go buy really good wetlands, okay, and that are really prime and have lots of functions and values, okay. So basically, what the state was, they were charging a 20% fee. So for the state to broker this $45,000, they were charging the developers $9,000, when it clearly doesn't cost $9,000 to buy an acre of wetland. Well, I introduced legislation that cut that fee in half, down to 10%, which brought it down to $4,500. And so that, I just want to let you know, is what the Wetlands Mitigation Program's about, and why it can be good, because it takes wetlands that have poor functions and values, and we trade those to buy really good wetlands that have high functions and values.
Thank you, Chris. And John, you wanted to, how about another 30 seconds? We'll set the clock at 1 or 2, and when it gets halfway, you're done.
Senator Bradley, I am aware of the Senate vote on the title loans, and there are times I'm grateful for even a Republican-dominated Senate. But the point is that Mr. Ahlgren and Mr. Schmidt both voted for the bill that passed the House. Both voted for SB 160 and SB 57. One in regulation of title loans and the other in the regulation of installment loans.
Let's go on to another question. There are 2 constitutional amendments that have been proposed for voters. One is to prohibit an income tax. The second is to allow the legislature to override administrative rules and procedures of the courts. Taking 1 minute, not 2, could you each respond to those 2 constitutional amendments, your positions on each? And why don't we start with Jeff?
All right, the first that we're talking about is the income tax ban. While, of course, I said I am against an income tax and would vote against an income tax, I don't think it belongs in the Constitution. There's a few reasons why. For one, we don't know what's going to happen in 50 years. Likely none of us are going to be involved in state government in 50 years, so why are we making the decision for them going forward? The second, if you remember the debt ceiling debacle that we went through, you saw the United States have their credit rating downgraded for the first time. Now, that was because there was uncertainty about whether the United States government was going to meet its debt obligations. Now we're going to put New Hampshire in the same place where our bond rating can potentially be downgraded because if some catastrophic event happens and we need a surge of revenue, and that could come from anywhere, anytime, weather changes, anything else. We don't have any way to meet it. So it's a poorly thought out amendment, even though I am, as I said, against a income tax. And I'm sorry, the courts, I'm also against that. There's supposed to be a separation of powers, courts, judicial branch, legislative branch, and executive branch. And this is just a power grab by the legislative branch.
Ms. Woods.
Well, just about what I was going to say regarding the amendment to have the legislature have more power over the courts. It is just a naked power grab and would really mess up the separation of powers, which we need. There's a good reason that we don't have that situation right now that they're trying to change. And regarding the income tax amendment, I keep thinking of everyone likes to compare sitting around the table to doing the state budget. So imagine you're sitting around the table, you know that the bills are going up and up, and you're going to tear up and completely destroy every deposit ticket that you could possibly have, and you're going to tell everybody who's sitting around the table, whatever you do, make sure you don't bring any more money into this house. Make sure. And, we really have to be looking at what is being put in place for the future, even if I think it's very unlikely an income tax would even be proposed in the next session. But to codify it forever is silly.
Mr. White.
I concur on both points. To forever and ever eliminate the possibility of an income tax is to hamstring future generations. There may come a time when some Solomon will propose a tax package, including an income tax, that the voters of this state will approve. It may never come, but it should never be taken off the table forever. As for the legislature meddling with the courts, naked power grab, a very bad thing for the citizens of this state. The legislature has already done enough to the courts to deny access to justice.
Mr. Schmidt.
May I have I supported the amendment on the income tax ban. I think the New Hampshire advantage is something we need to maintain. Contrary to what you just heard, it does not memorialize it forever. The citizens of this state, in the future, should they deem it necessary, can certainly reverse it. You know, it's not cast in concrete forever. It takes a 2/3 vote. What it does is it brings stability and finality to an issue that's been going on forever. I also support the court issue. To say that this is getting into a separation of powers is absurd. We're talking about administrative rules. The legislature has always held, until quite recently, authority over the courts administratively. There is nothing in this legislation where the New Hampshire legislature will overrule a judicial ruling of that court. That's not what this is about. That whole court system and the millions of dollars it spends on the administrative side should be held accountable to the legislature. And the legislature, by the way, is you. You elect us. We're only taking back the authority that we had for 200 years. To suggest otherwise, I really take great umbrage at. Thank you.
Mr. Ahlgren.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. First of all, in regard to the income tax constitutional amendment, which I did vote for, what that vote meant was that we would put it on the ballot for you to decide, that it was something that we felt, or that I felt, that you should have a chance to vote on, whether you wanted it or not. As far as its finality, I concur with my good friend Representative Schmidt that if it does pass, then it doesn't mean it can't be repealed by who? You, the citizens. This is not the only method of getting a constitutional amendment. We're actually, the third one is voting for the Constitutional Convention, which isn't mentioned, but that's the other way a constitutional amendment can be put on, and it's every 10 years. However, what we haven't talked about here is that this just says income tax. I don't see anything here about a sales tax. If we needed a broad-based tax with an immediacy, not that I would necessarily personally support it, but it's still there. So to say that we could not possibly raise funds, and this someday there might be something catastrophic that we wouldn't see and we would suddenly need this income tax is just bunk. So I think you should vote how you feel about the income tax.
Mr. Bradley.
Thank you, Randy. This is obviously an opportunity for voters to weigh in whether we're going to retain the New Hampshire advantage and give greater protections or not. It really is a question that the voters will get to decide. I support it. With regard to the constitutional amendment on the courts, I want to not only emphasize what my good friend Mr. Schmidt said, but also tell people that the justices themselves were in agreement with this language. So I don't know how anybody could call it a power grab when the Supreme Court justices thought this was a reasonable compromise. And I would take the remaining time to say it's unfortunate that perhaps the most important constitutional amendment is not on the ballot. That is one dealing with education funding, allowing targeting of education aid to communities that need it the most, and ending donor towns. And I certainly hope that we have an opportunity to flesh out where everybody on this stage is tonight in terms of a constitutional amendment on ed funding. I support it. It has to be a top priority in my view.
Thank you. And just to move along, since time is getting short, there's two questions that I'll throw into one. What's your position on educational funding and gambling? And are we on, Beverly, are you the one starting, I think, on this going around?
Well, I'll start with the gambling. No. It will not help. It will only undermine things, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we need. The education funding issue obviously has been being kicked around from one legislature to the next for decades. I think that we need an entirely new and very comprehensive conversation between the legislature and the voters. I think that we need to sit down in every town across this district and talk about how we're going to do this really, given the tax structure and given who pays and given what we need. How are we going to do it? And that's what I think we have to do, because the current structure of things is just that we have all these entrenched positions and the ball gets kicked around in a circle every single time, and that's going to keep happening unless we change the conversation.
When we took away prohibition from the mobsters, they turned to gambling. Now we want to join them. I will not vote for a casino. I will not vote for expanded gambling. We have enough of it. I hear a lot of nonsense about the poor racetrack may go out of business if they don't get slots. You wouldn't give slots to the corner grocer who was having a hard time. Why give it to them? The gambling industry feeds on desperation and false hope. That's not the way to raise revenue. I'm not going to vote for that. As for education funding, we need a new approach other than relying on real estate taxes. We're going to have to find some other source of revenue. We're going to have to find a way to make sure that every child in this state gets an equal opportunity for education, has a facility that they can go to where they can learn. We have to be able to prepare each and every one of our children for a fruitful life.
Mr. Schmidt.
I think the failure of CACR 12 to make it on the ballot was my greatest disappointment of this past legislative session. It was an opportunity for you, the voters of New Hampshire, to come to issue with the school funding, and it didn't happen. And because it didn't happen, I'm not sure it's ever going to happen again. Basically, local communities really should have the right to decide how they want to educate their children. I believe parents should have the right to say to a child, or to pull a child out of a bad school to find an alternative school. I support those type of alternative schools. I think they're a good thing in New Hampshire. I think it gets back to local rule. When it gets into the gambling issue, I'm not opposed to it. If someone comes up with a viable plan to support a destination casino, one or two, with the possibility of bringing revenue into this state in the area of $30 to $40 million, I would not stand in the way of that $30 or $40 million.
Mr. Ahlgren.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that getting a constitutional amendment that would allow us to target aid, and thus ending the donor towns, is something that I'm strongly in favor for and consider it a top priority. I would mention that when we voted on that CACR in the House, that even though Governor Lynch was in support of it, his Democratic counterparts, I guess in this instead of colleagues in the House, only a handful voted for it. So I would definitely want to see that. As far as gambling is concerned, I would support gambling, but also it would be in a destination casino. Something I haven't mentioned is I'm on the New Hampshire State Parks Advocacy Board, and Cannon Mountain, which is a revenue driver for the park system, they don't have enough hotel rooms up there. If we were to build a destination casino, or not us, but if we found an investor to build a destination casino within 15 minutes of that mountain that we could do environmentally in a safe way, I'd listen to that. But as far as having expanded gambling and gambling everywhere and that sort of thing is not my cup of tea.
Mr. Bradley.
Well, thank you again. The constitutional amendment, it was one of my top priorities in 2011 and 2012, and I must have met with Governor Lynch a couple of dozen times trying to find bipartisan participation on a constitutional amendment, because that's what it will take to pass it. Governor Lynch, the Senate, the House leadership finally did get to a position on what I thought was a very good constitutional amendment. Unfortunately, it came up a little short. But this is a model of how we should work, and I was certainly proud to be able to have worked with Governor Lynch on CACR 12. With regard to gambling, I'm very skeptical. I have always voted against expanded gambling, so I guess I would agree with my colleagues to my left here. Here are some of the issues that I see with regard to gambling. Very uncertain revenue source. It undermines other businesses in the environment of the casino. Obviously, there's social problems, broken families. I would not vote for anything that wasn't put out fully to bid. And lastly, I think one of Governor Lynch's big concerns, why he said he was going to veto expanded gambling, is we don't have the regulatory structure in place. So these are all criteria for me, but even if we meet those criteria, I'm not sure in the live free or die state that, especially where we're surrounded by casinos in other states near us, that we need to go that route.
Mr. Ballard.
I guess, like the senator, I'll skip over and I'll agree with his two colleagues and our friend on the right. I agree with expanded gambling if it's done in the scope of a destination casino. My criteria would be either north of Route 302 or north of Route 2, so it would be helping our friends in the North Country. And if it's on the eastern side of the state, it would also drive the economy of Senate District 3 because of the Route 16 corridor. Again, electronic slots. If anyone's been to the game room in Newport, Rhode Island, it's just the most depressing, sad thing I've ever seen, and we don't need that in New Hampshire. The school funding amendment. This was another short-sighted attempt at a good fix, but it came up very short-sighted. The way this would have worked was the legislature would have determined what an adequate education needed to be funded at each year. So if you had an extreme right legislature, it could be funded at $0. If you have an extreme left legislature, it could be funded at $15,000 a year. So that affects you, the taxpayers, of not having any stability. And again, stability breeds growth. If you don't know what your tax bill is going to be from year to year, that's not a recipe to grow the economy.
We'll try to get a couple more questions in. This is a audience question. If Mitt Romney becomes president, it's very possible he will appoint judges that will overturn Roe versus Wade. Should this happen, you as a representative may be asked to support new legislation regarding abortion rights. Would you allow abortion in the case of rape or incest, and if not, what should the penalty be? So basically, it's a question on abortion, and I believe, John, we start with you. We'll take 1 minute each if we could.
I can't have an abortion. Why should I tell those who can have an abortion that they can't? Certainly, I would vote to uphold Roe versus Wade or similar legislation. A woman's right to choose is her right. We have no business fiddling with it. The extreme leadership in the House dearly wants to, in the name of eliminating government interference in our lives, bring Big Brother into the bedroom. Interference is okay if you're a woman. You shouldn't be covered for contraceptive devices or contraception by insurance companies, but we can cover Viagra and vasectomy. Got to stop this nonsense of discriminating against women in health care. Of course, I protect a woman's right for abortion. I hate abortion, but I'll protect your right to it.
Mr. Schmidt.
Can I have the, I'm so sorry.
I consider myself pro-life. If that scenario should come to New Hampshire, I would support a woman's right in instances of rape or incest. What can I say on it?
Mr. Ahlgren.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Well, I guess my first comment is that just the initial idea that Mitt Romney is going to nominate judges on the sole purpose of somehow overturning Roe versus Wade, when I just don't believe that that is his main priority while in the president's office, I find a bit preposterous. However, if it were to come to a situation where I would have to vote on legislation that would allow a woman to be able to have an abortion based on what rape and incest, I mean, obviously that person should have that choice. In spite of my for life voting record, which is pretty good unless you're way over there on the right, I guess that's the answer to the question, and so I guess I'll move on to Senator Bradley.
Thank you very much. I mean, look, I know Governor Romney well. I see him occasionally when he's in New Hampshire. Governor Romney's priorities are growing the economy, getting Americans back to work, lowering the cost of health care, lowering the cost of energy, and resolving the fact that we have trillion-dollar deficits stretching far, far into the future as far as the eye can see, and they're unsustainable. These are Governor Romney's priorities. I think everybody here knows I am pro-choice. I disagree with Governor Romney on that, and I think it's a respectful disagreement, and it should continue to be a respectful disagreement. These are principled positions, and I think that we have to find a way to, as Americans, respect our differences on these opinions. I respect my friends and colleagues who are pro-life, and I hope that there's that same respect back.
Mr. Ballard.
Well, I guess in this scenario, we have to ask which Mitt Romney is being elected president, because we've seen a Mitt Romney who's been pro-life, we've seen a Mitt Romney who's been pro-choice, we've seen a Mitt Romney that would defund Planned Parenthood, we've seen a Mitt Romney that believes every woman should have access to contraception. So I guess which Mitt? But seriously, as an adult Christian male, I am fundamentally opposed to abortion. But as John said, I would never try to force that upon anyone else. I respect a woman's right to choose. But more importantly, as we continue to have this abortion discussion, what we really should be focusing our efforts on, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, is preventing the need for abortion. That should be our number one priority. So if that means making sure that we're funding adoptive services so women know they have that opportunity, if it's making sure that we're funding Planned Parenthood, which our Republican legislature did not want to do and tried to cut out the funding for in New Hampshire. Prevention, again, is the best medicine. So let's just prevent abortion.
Ms. Woods.
Thank you. I am not happy about the language being used. I consider myself pro-life and pro-choice. It's just that I am actually also to have, I think that a woman's right to choose about pregnancy is completely her own business between her and her doctor. There is really no reason for the state to become involved and get in there. And I would like to remark here that Representative Ahlgren voted for a bill requiring doctors to say things that are not really true to a woman who is seeking an abortion. And our Republican-led legislature has passed or attempted to pass a number of laws interfering with a woman's right to have her choice be between herself and her doctor. And in my view, that's not right.
And we have a question on the other side of the spectrum. You in favor of Obamacare, and if it is not repealed, should New Hampshire accept the federal money with the federal strings attached? And I think we're back to you, Steve, and if everybody could spend 1 minute, and then we'll go into closing remarks.
Well, I guess we're going to find out the future of Obamacare in about 19 days, I suppose. At the moment, Obamacare, rightly or wrongly, is the law of the land. I suspect if President Obama is elected, it will not be overturned. I'm not even sure it's going to be overturned if we have a Governor Romney in there, in all of its nuances. If it's going to be the law of the land, then frankly, I guess New Hampshire is going to have to comply with it.
Mr. Ahlgren?
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Well, I guess the short answer to the question is that if President Obama is reelected, and we are in a situation where Obamacare is definitely coming to fruition, then we need to take the steps necessary to comply. We would, as a state, for the benefit of the citizens, have to, strongly consider returning that money, unless there were, some other unidentifiable reason to me at this point to do not to do that.
Mr. Bradley?
This is a extraordinarily difficult answer to give in 1 minute, because there are really two very compelling arguments to make on either side. The next legislature, the biggest decision it's going to make is whether to expand eligibility for Medicaid and accept more federal money. I've asked Commissioner Toompas to do an actuarial report and to take into account both sides of that situation. On one hand, we have the hospitals offering charity care that they're not getting adequate funding for, so there is a reason to take the Medicaid money to lower private health insurance, which is being driven higher by the charity care that hospitals offer to people that are slightly higher than the Medicaid match. On the other hand, having served in Washington, I know that with trillion-dollar deficits stretching far into the future, that the promise, the so-called promise, to pay for 100% of the Medicaid costs for the first 3 years, 90% of them for the next 7 years, and then after that, a big question mark, that these are decisions that need to be taken into account rationally. That's why I've asked for Commissioner Toompas to give us actuarial data so that in the next budget, we really, whether we're Republican or Democrat or Independent, can make a rational decision based on what the facts are and the best interest for New Hampshire. I'm skeptical, but I'm open-minded.
Mr. Ballard?
Well, I support the Affordable Care Act, and one compelling reason to support it is it's been tried and it works. Massachusetts, under Romney Care, has implemented it successfully. The people of Massachusetts are very happy with the system, and tonight we've talked about the skyrocketing costs of insurance premiums. Do you know which state had the lowest cost rises? That's been Massachusetts, because Affordable Care Act does work. We do have to take the money, we have to set up the exchanges, and we have to, again, make sure we're taking state control and having the state set it up in the model that we wish to see. It's funny, it talks about the charity care and hospitals not having enough money to provide charity care. Well, one of the reasons was because of the new tax placed on hospitals. They can say it's not a new tax because it was always there. The difference was the hospitals were given back the money that was taxed on the Medicaid payments that they received. They were taxed, and the state just returned it in order for them to provide charity care. So if we wonder why the hospitals don't have the money to provide charity care, I think we know why. It's that new tax.
Ms. Woods?
Well, I'd like to take this moment to rebut something that Governor Romney said the other day, which was that nobody dies from lack of insurance. Harvard study some years back estimated that we have 45,000 U.S. citizens die every year from lack of insurance coverage. and that I and every other uninsured adult among us is 40% more likely to die than an insured person sitting next to us of the same gender, age, and health. So insurance isn't perfect. Obamacare, or Affordable Care Act, whatever you want to call it, isn't perfect, but it's far better than the alternative, because if we had no Obamacare, the estimates that I saw, if Romney got in and it was repealed, were that we would have 72 million uninsured Americans. And, you know, all of that death and disease is not just an expense, and it is expensive, but it hits home. I myself lost a good friend at the age of 40 last year who had been working for a small business that couldn't afford to cover him for 17 years, and he had a stroke at 40 and died. And I don't want to see any more like that.
Rounding out the pack, Mr. White.
My answer is yes. I hope you all remember the question.
And with that, John, why don't you start with the closing remarks? And you each have 2 minutes, and we should be done right around 9 o'clock.
2 years ago in this very room, Mr. Schmidt said if elected he was going to Concord and he was going to cut spending and he was going to cut spending and he was going to cut spending and then we're going to concentrate on jobs. Well, he did half of that. He voted to cut spending by draconian amounts. 2 years ago, Mr. Ahlgren, when questioned about a vote he made, explained that his ignorance on whether he voted this way or that, on the fact that he couldn't read all the bills. He didn't have time to read all the bills. He looked to the leadership. And he got elected, and he went to Concord, and he proved that was accurate. He followed the leadership. They talked jobs. They went down there, and they brought guns to the State House. They want to bring guns every place. They cut the funding for education. They cut vital services. Wolfeboro is going to have its taxes go up in the near future because of the mentally disabled people who are being ferried to Huggins Hospital weekly by our ambulance people, our firefighters, and our police officers. It's a problem. As Mr. Ballard has explained, the problems don't go away just because the money dries up. We have an opportunity on the county level for a center to take care of homeless veterans at no cost to the county, using part of the old nursing home. I believe Mr. Ahlgren and Mr. Schmidt are opposed to that. Mr. Schmidt, I believe, wants to tear the old nursing home down so it can't be used for anything. A valuable county asset, but it'll cost money to get rid of it. I am for civility in debate, even though it may not always sound like it here tonight. Common sense. If I go to Concord, and I hope I do, I will answer to my constituents, to my conscience, and to common sense. I do not think that Mr. Schmidt and Mr. Ahlgren deserve another term. I think we can do better. And if I go to Concord, I will do better.
Can you wrap it up there, John?
Ms. Woods will do better.
Thank you. Ms. Woods.
Well, thank you very much to everyone for having the patience to sit through this lengthy discussion. And I would like to respectfully ask all of you who are voters in Wolfeboro to vote for me on November 6th. I do intend to go to Concord to bring an open mind, but a careful mind to the problems that face us. And unlike the current representation, I also am totally devoted to the idea that a representative should be going back and forth between Concord and Wolfeboro and coming here and filling you in on what's going on. because I meet an awful lot of people who have no clue what they have been up to in Concord. And what the most recent 2 years of legislature has been up to in Concord is pursuing an agenda, part of which is given to them by an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is funded by the Koch brothers and other large corporate entities. And ALEC brings all kinds of requests, and people sign up for it, and our leadership has signed up for it and has brought us things like right to work. Right to work was not an issue that was brought to the state by New Hampshire employers who wanted right to work. In right to work states, wages are considerably lower. And I have to mention here that our current representatives voted to repeal the minimum wage. And that is an issue for families and especially for women. Too many of us are working at the minimum wage. So I would like to say that we really need to bring some common sense, not be penny wise and pound foolish, because everything that's cut there is going to come to your property taxes here. Please vote for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ballard.
All right. I want to thank you for your patience with us tonight as we danced around some of your questions and answered some of them directly. I hope that I've demonstrated to you tonight that if you elect me as your state senator, I will be able to go to Concord and I will be able to think fully through all of the decisions I make with a firm understanding of the real life consequences it's going to have on your life. What we've demonstrated tonight, I think, is a very clear understanding that just because you cut money to something doesn't make the problem go away. Like Beverly just mentioned, it ends up in your property taxes. As we've listened to our friends on the right tonight, all they've mentioned talking about is cutting as many business taxes as possible. They have no interest in what's going to happen to your property taxes. Again, I've demonstrated very clearly that all of these problems still exist, and all of these problems are just trickling down towards your property tax. Now, I'm a realist. I know that not every program that was cut can immediately be immediately returned to its full levels. But as our economy continues to grow, the revenue will be there. So rather than continue, once the revenue starts to be there, instead of cutting all that revenue, I think we need to invest it back into these programs that were cut that have resulted in so much downshifting. Again, I know that as your state senator, I'll be able to best put myself into your shoes. I've demonstrated over and over that long-term consequences, even though something may appear better today, once we start to think about the long-term consequences of them, and there's so many I didn't get to go into tonight. One I'm going to try to take 15 seconds was the prescription drug monitoring that Senator Bradley championed. That was a great program. I applaud him for putting that forward. But again, we're going to cut off, basically it's going to allow doctors to identify people who are doctor shopping and receiving their narcotics illegally. It's going to cut off their supply to narcotics, but they're still going to have that narcotic dependency. And we've cut mental health funding, so they're not going to have anywhere to receive treatment. So the addiction is still there. So what are they going to do? They're going to turn to crime to continue to get their narcotics, because we're not going to treat the problem that we've identified. It's great to identify the problem, but if there's no way to deal with it, then again, it's going to lead to higher crime rates. And I have that ability to think through, and I think Senator Bradley in his 22 years serving the state of New Hampshire has lost some of that. And that's what I would bring if you vote for me. Thank you.
Mr. Bradley.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. It's been an honor to have served in so many different capacities, but again, for 4 years in the New Hampshire Senate. I think tonight we've had a pretty good discussion, and I think we've seen some very compelling differences. And I think that voters should be aware that if you send me back to Concord, you will always have somebody that will ask the question, how are we going to pay for it? I don't want to go back to the days that we had an LLC tax, a 24% increase in spending, 100 tax and fee increases, job loss, undermining the competitive advantage of New Hampshire, borrowing for operating expenses, inflating revenue, and all the tricks that were used to grow government in the last 4 years. We simply can't afford that, and I believe that we can't go back to it. And so I will look to be frugal, but make sure that government does serve the people that it's meant to serve. But we always have to ask how we're going to pay for it. If jobs are the big issue in whether it's state elections or national elections, I would urge voters to look at the business and industry scorecard that just came out. I'm one of only 5 senators that had a 100% pro-jobs voting record because it's my top priority, and it will continue to be my top priority. I've been endorsed by the National Federation of Independent Businesses. They're an advocacy group for small businesses across our country. It's an honor to be endorsed by an organization that represents the backbone of what makes our country tick, that being small businesses. It's really been an honor to have served our state in so many different capacities over the years. I worked to save 5,000 jobs at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard when I was in Washington, a key element of preserving jobs in our state. I was twice honored by the New Hampshire Veterans of Foreign Wars for my work on veterans issues. I've been named Legislator of the Year by New Futures because of my work to prevent illegal prescription drug abuse. I look forward to continuing to work in the bipartisan fashion that I've displayed over the years and to solve problems that New Hampshire confronts. I ask for your vote. It's been an honor to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ahlgren.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Well, I guess first of all, I need to rebut a couple remarks from Mr. White regarding the nursing home annex. I don't know if you all remember, but the reason why we built the new nursing home was because the old nursing home wasn't a proper facility to house people. And that was decided that it wasn't worth renovating the old nursing home to put into a facility to house people. So I'm going to have an open mind. But when you present to us after 6 months of a building lying dormant and 2 years of being able to presumably find someone else to come in to utilize this structure, that you have nothing, and then to use this during the election, I mean, you know, quite frankly, I don't think if that facility was good enough for our elderly, it's probably not good enough for our veterans. That's my opinion. But I will have an open mind, and I'll look at what they have to offer. In regards to the bill that I didn't even remember I voted on from Mr. White from the last time around, well, that's because he referenced the bill by the number, HB 14 whatever. And then he gave a very inconclusive idea of what the bill was. So I didn't know what he was talking about. But I later on went to look at what the bill was because I was interested, and I found out that what the bill was that they were taking what they call the look back for Medicaid, the look back of Medicaid if you parents give you your house. And it currently was at 3 years. They'd extended it to 3 years. And then the bill was to extend that look back to 5 years. Now I think part of the American dream is to grow up, raise a family, build a house, and give something to your kids when you get done, okay? You know, any of us could be in a situation where our kids need to live in our house, and we're getting old enough to realize, you know what, I'm going to give it to them so they have it when I'm gone, okay? 5 years in advance of me having a stroke, 4.5 years of me having a stroke, that's a reason for the government to gobble up that money and take that house away from my children? I don't think so. That's not what I think the American dream is. When it comes to mental health, I'd be very careful about who you're describing as who's been cutting mental health. Over the years, I think we'd see it on both sides. In fact, Governor Lynch completely stripped the bill of the disability wait list. Us Republicans, we put it back in. Okay, he stripped it out. No disability funding for the wait list.
Chris, can you wrap it right up?
I will. The minimum wage law repealed, that's because the minimum wage law was lower than federal minimum wage because the law was moot. So we weren't lowering anyone's minimum wage.
Chris, you're all set. Thank you.
And I guess I'm done.
Mr. Schmidt.
I think you should bang your shoe on the table. Can I
Oh, sorry.
And now you have 1 minute.
You're tough, Randy. First of all, I'd like to thank you again and our audience for listening to it. You've heard a lot tonight, and you've heard a lot of divergent viewpoints. I'm not going to sit here and rebut everything that you heard. I think some of it was just plain silly. What I would like to say is that, contrary to belief, most of the work done down in the legislature is bipartisan. The vast majority of bills here are approved by Republicans and Democrats. They are approved by Republicans and Democrats in committee work. And with the exception of some which clearly we disagree on, it's a place where you can actually get something done. Let me talk about the budget. The budget was the big thing. 2 years ago, I ran and I said, this is crazy. You know, we have almost $1 billion hole. You cannot spend that much money. I went down there and I voted as I told you I was going to vote. And I expect you to hold me accountable for that. If the voters of Wolfeboro decide that we went too far or whatever, then you have an alternative. But that spending hurts everybody. It's unsustainable. People, look at what's going on in this country. Did you see the pictures of riots in Greece? That's not so far removed from here in 10 years, when everyone has to take across-the-board cuts because of spending so out of control. This is common sense. One of the comments we heard is that the legislature has been taken over by free staters. What nonsense. Absolute nonsense. The only thing the legislature has been taken over by is people who I like to think went down there and exhibited some common sense, rolled back some fees that never should have been increased, and have brought fiscal sanity back to our state. I hope the majority of voters of Wolfeboro agree with that. I hope they send me and Chris and Jeb back, because that's what we need there. We need common sense. On the social issue, we're not right-wing zealots at all. Not true. So again, I ask for your support and I ask for your vote. And again, I appreciate you listening to my little tirade here at the end. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the debate. Thank you, candidates. I thought it was very civil, and thanks very much.
Knocking down our names right and
You
left.
can be the timekeeper anytime. Good job. You know, it was a good job. You guys did all the work, though. Great job.